Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cecil Chick, and I use female pronouns she, her, and hers. Thank you for joining our first critical conversation, part of the election series, brought to you by the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Programs in partnership with the Department of Politics, Administration, and Justice. Today, our panelists will be providing nonpartisan information on the U.S. presidential election process, results, and information that's pertinent to consider in the future. Before we get started with today's program, I wanted to provide some housekeeping information. First and foremost, we want to let all the attendees know that you are in a Zoom webinar, and with that, that means you will be muted and the access to a camera will not be available to all attendees. We will have a moderator that will lead us into the dialogue with our panelists today. We encourage everyone here to listen to understand to what our panelists are sharing. And if there are any follow-up questions, please use the Q&A function and we will address them as time permits. If you wish to ask any other questions related to our topic today, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function, which is located in the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. This dialogue will be recorded tonight and posted with closed captioning on the Titan TV YouTube channel for everyone to enjoy. At the end of this program, please fill out the event feedback form that will be sent to all participants in the email that you use to register. Last but not least, our next critical conversation series will be on Monday, November 9th at 10 a.m. with a follow-up dialogue session on civic engagement and civil dialogue. To kick off our event today, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Dr. Scott Spitzer, Associate Professor in Political Science here at Cal State Fullerton. Thank you, Dr. Spitzer, for providing our campus community with this valuable information.
Thank you, Cecil, and welcome everybody. So happy that you're with us today. We are in the midst of history, as they say, as the vote continues, the vote counting continues in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, and as the president and his supporters continue to launch court challenges to the process by which these mailed-in ballots are counted, and the nation is poised in political uncertainty. Knowing that this might be our, more or less our collective experience of this election, the Civic Engagement Working Group here at Cal State Fullerton thought we should get some of our campus experts together in political science and history to provide some grounding for what we already know about this election and what we don't know, to help all of us in this community stay grounded as we continue to process these unprecedented politics that can be at times, well, disorienting. Among our political scientists are Rob Castro, a professor in the Division of Politics, Administration, and Justice at California State University, Fullerton, right here. And his work focuses on immigration law and policy, refugee and human rights law, immigration, and the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as ethnic politics, public interest law, and advocacy. Professor Natalie Fousekis is the director of the Lawrence DeGraff Center for Oral and Public History and a professor of history here at Cal State Fullerton. Most recently, she directed the center's Women, Politics, and Activism Oral History Project, which has recorded interviews with over 300 Southern California women activists and women in politics. And Dr. Robert Robinson is an associate professor of political science, and his research focuses on judicial politics, American political development, policy change, and cultural theory. Professor Robinson's work is published widely in leading journals on law, politics, and policy. And here at Cal State Fullerton, he teaches courses in American government, constitutional law, and civil liberties. And I'm Scott Spitzer, political science professor with a focus on American government. My research focuses on the dynamics of racial politics, social welfare policy making in the United States with an emphasis on presidential leadership. In addition, we have Joey Forsyte, who is the founder and executive director for A Band of Voters, an organization dedicated to encouraging student voter and civic engagement. After the 2016 election, she authored the legislative proposal that ultimately passed in California, focused on this objective, AB 963, the Student Civic and Voter Empowerment Act, This law requires every CSU and community college in California to have a plan for mobilizing students to be engaged in public affairs, including but not limited to voting. Finally, Dr. Mitchell is here from our counseling and psychological services to share some resources for all of us for helping us to stay centered around good self-care and healthy responses to the challenges that our politics presents for so many of us. Dr. Mitchell is a graduate of Loma Linda University, and he uses an integrated approach in his care that heavily emphasizes cognitive behavioral therapy mostly for students with a very wide variety of concerns, including phase of life problems, anxiety, depression, and trauma. He's also a liaison for our athletics department to CAPS. He assists campus veterans and helps students who are themselves interested in becoming helping professionals. So that's our panel today. It's a pretty amazing group of people with a lot of expertise, and hopefully we can help everybody understand what's happening around us and that we're in the middle of a little bit better. So let me just start with just a very few comments about where we're at right now. We've had the highest voting turnout in over 100 years, and nearly half of the votes went to President Trump, and slightly more than half seem to be going for a Democratic nominee and former Vice President Joe Biden. And it looks like right now that Vice President Biden will become very soon our president-elect. So why do I say this? Actually, until December 14th, when the Electoral College votes formally, we can't say that he is the president-elect formally. But we can look at the popular vote outcomes in all of the different states where the votes have been completely tallied, and look at essentially what they tell us. And right now, we know that 253 Electoral College votes have been formally projected for Biden and 213 for Trump in states that have completed their vote tallies. The states that have not been called include Arizona with 11 Electoral College votes, Nevada with 6 Electoral College votes, Pennsylvania, we all know about that, 20 votes, Georgia with 16, and actually North Carolina still hasn't been called with 15 Electoral College votes. So the bottom line is right now it looks like Biden is very likely to win in Pennsylvania, as the vast majority of the remaining votes that have yet to be counted are from the Philadelphia area, which has been going for Biden by close to 80% so far. And if that continues, Biden will likely win that state, and he'll have more than the 270 Electoral College votes to win. He could also win in Arizona and Nevada, where vote tallies have him leading President Trump right now, even without winning in Pennsylvania. Georgia, which is just like a complete toss-up at this point, so close that there's already a requested recount and across both of those areas. In the Congress, the House of Representatives, the Democrats had a net loss of about 4 seats so far. And in the Senate, it's pretty even Steven. The Democrats gained 2 seats, and both the Democrats and the Republicans right now claim about 48 Senate seats. There are 4 seats still to be decided, 2 of them in Georgia, which will be decided in special elections. So it's a really, really, really close election. And one of the things that I think we can observe out of this is that the polls didn't seem to suggest it was going to be this close. So what happened with the polls, right? Why did the polling industry, we've done more polling than ever before in this election. And the question is, why did they get it so wrong? And so we can say a couple things about that. We're getting into this world where a lot of pollsters like Real Clear Politics and 538 try to take a lot of different polls and average them together and give us probabilities and things like that. But the bottom line is this year, the polls were very, very far off. And there are a lot of theories why. One of the biggest theories is that Trump voters don't trust the media. And there's lots of evidence to show that that is the case, and that they are so we can extrapolate from that and say maybe they also don't trust polling organizations, especially media polling organizations. and then are less likely to answer and show up in those polls. There are other theories that the algorithms for deciding who is likely to vote, which is a key determination about how these polling organizations sample, how they choose the people they're going to interview, were somehow off and didn't take into account the people who actually did show up in the polls. One thing we can tell you is that the polling industry has got a lot of self-reflecting to do moving forward. So those are a couple observations. The last thing I want to say is that, we can look at this election as as the glass half empty or glass half full. That's how I look at it right now. On the one side, we're more divided than ever, right? We can talk about the levels of partisan polarization and how close this election is and how fierce the determination is on both sides about these electoral results. And that's one way to look at it. I tend to also look at it as democracy is alive and well in the United States of America. There have been a lot of people talking about how democracy is dying, but more people have participated in this election than in 100 years. And people have went out of their way in a pandemic to vote, and found different ways to do that, even when it was difficult to do that. And so I take that as an inspiration for me. And we have lots of work to do in the United States of America to heal, but certainly there's no lack of will to participate in the process. And with that, I'll end my comments and let's hear from some other of our commentators. How about you, Professor Castro? Rob, I think you're still muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me? All right. Well, I'm Rob Castro, Professor of Politics, Administration, and Justice here at the California State University, Fullerton. And I think Scott captured the dynamic quite well. Wow, what an election, right? So the first part of my comments are going to focus in on people of color and how they voted, principally Black and Latino folks. And then I'm going to transition in and focus in on immigration regulation and policy, and try to kind of put my my crystal ball out and see which way the wind is blowing on that, depending upon who wins the presidency. But first, electoral participation. I'm not an election scholar, so these will amount to kind of observations, right? So I think for Black folks, their votes and participation has, can't be underestimated. Just really, really decisive, particularly in states like Pennsylvania and Georgia with the early mail-in voting, and that tended to eat away quickly at the percentage that President Trump had established, the beachhead that he had established with the same-day voting. So the Black vote in the large urban areas like Atlanta and Philadelphia, coupled with the surrounding suburban votes, really helped candidate Biden catch up and ultimately surpass President Trump. The discussions I've been privy to have really embraced and applauded the work of Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who worked really, really hard, I think, to lay the groundwork to facilitate voting within the Black community. For the Latino vote, let me give you some numbers here in some of the battleground states that are particularly relevant right now. So for Pennsylvania, the estimated votes cast amongst Latinos are about 300,000. For Nevada, about 250,000 Latino votes cast. For Arizona, about 700,000 Latino votes cast. And kind of in stepping back and looking at the overall picture here, I think you have two pivotal stories. one of which is in Florida, the other in Arizona. So in Florida in particular, the Miami-Dade County, you have a complex mix of people of Cuban heritage, Venezuelan heritage, some Puerto Ricanos, folks from Puerto Rico who tended to trend very strongly for Donald Trump. And my initial impressions are because of perhaps anti-socialist ideologies, maybe for religious reasons, but they only amount to about 3.1% of the total Latino population nationwide. In Arizona, I think the stories with Maricopa County, right, where you have a large Mexican-American population trending strongly for former Vice President Biden. The numbers I've seen say about 75% of that population voted for Biden. It's typically younger and more progressive community of voters, kind of very interested in social justice issues. I wanted to drill down a little bit and look at county by county, and three really pivotal counties right now in southern Arizona, southeastern Arizona: Yuma, Maricopa, and Pima counties. So at the county level for Yuma, about 74% of Latinos voted for Biden's, principally Mexican Americans. In Maricopa, you're looking at about 78% of the Mexican American community there. And Pima just being the highest, right? 81% of the Mexican American community there cast their vote for Biden. So what's this tell us? I think it tells us that there's a great deal of diversity, certainly within the Latino vote. I think it accurately kind of reflects what pollsters had anticipated. Latinos would vote, with about 2/3 of Latino population voting Democratic and 1/3 voting for Republicans. And there's some takeaways here, right? So with respect to the Latino vote, it's one of growing importance, right? Colorado flipped a US Senate seat almost entirely because of the Latino vote. Nevada appears to be staying blue because Biden won the Latino vote. And in New Mexico, they elected their first Latino US senator, principally because of the Latino vote in New Mexico. Okay, so that's my take on the elections. Let's get to immigration. So I wanted to build a little bit of context here, right? So I think you can think of President Trump's first term as, with respect to immigration law and policy, as one rooted in twin goals, okay? So goal number one, increased enforcement at the border, and number two, expanded interior enforcement. And I think it'd be good to think about it in this way. So all the conventional enforcement mechanisms were in play during the Trump administration that had been in play during the Obama administration. They have just shifted strongly and dramatically to the right, meaning that they become much more stringent. There's some real differences, though, in how the Obama administration approached immigration enforcement and how the Trump administration approached immigration enforcement. And again, this is me kind of building context for my later observations. So under Obama, I think immigration enforcement was rooted greatly in deporting criminal aliens through the CAP, that's a criminal alien program, and ESCOM, the Secure Communities program. Whereas under the Trump administration, it was much more, I think, expansive and muscular, in the sense of they were removing what used to be called deportation. They were removing pretty much anyone that they could find. Okay, and which amounted to about a 41% increase in the number of people apprehended and removed versus the earlier Obama administration. Let's drill down a little bit and look specifically kind of at what the Trump administration focused on in terms of their enforcement. So there was increased audits and raids against employers and unconventional employers at that. So things like farms and 7-Elevens. There was terminations of the TPS program, the Temporary Protected Status program, which detrimentally affected Salvadorian folks. There was a travel ban and refugee restrictions. And in fact, during the Trump administration, they lowered the annual cap on refugee admissions. So during the 2020 alone, only about 18,000 refugees have been admitted into the US, whereas in previous administrations, you're looking at 100,000 plus each year. So you also had an asylum ban, and I think COVID gave the Trump administration some cover in that. There were forcible separations of children from parents, an expansion in the use of what's known as the public charge exclusion, which I can explain about later if folks are interested. What can we look forward to with respect to if Trump continues as the nation's president? I think you're looking at a continued freeze on green cards and visas, a more continuous narrowing of asylum eligibility, an attempt to punish sanctuary cities through cutting either grants or through an executive order, an abolishment of the nation's lottery system. I think as a consequence, I think you're going to see more deaths at the border as kind of increasingly desperate people are trying to, cross into the US. Unfortunately, I think you're going to see more very gritty human rights violations, allegations, like those involving involuntary hysterectomies at a Georgia facility. I think President Trump is going to make good on his promise, his initial promise to build at least some of the wall. I think the Trump administration is going to convert the nation's overarching immigration system that was based on family into a point-based system. And I think you're going to see a more aggressive and expanded use of federal criminal prosecutions against humanitarian organizations working at the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, conversely, if Joe Biden wins and becomes the nation's president, I think you're going to see a very different situation. I think you're going to see a path to citizenship for undocumented folks. I think you're going to see a border policy that's going to be muscular with respect to enforcement, but it's not going to include a wall. It's probably going to include things like more personnel, more technology, infrastructure in terms of maybe some light fencing and roads. I think you're going to see the abolishment of family separations and prolonged detentions. I think you're going to see the abolishment as well of travel bans, particularly those against Muslim majority nations that are currently in effect. I think you're going to see the protection of DACA, the DACA dreamers. And I think you're going to see a reestablishment of the conventional channels for asylum claims. That's what I predict.
Thank you so much, Professor Castro. That was really, really helpful in thinking about that very, very important issue for all of us. Professor Fousekis is going to talk to us a little bit about women and gender in the 2020 election and beyond.
Thank you, Scott. You can hear me, right?
I can.
Okay. So like all of my panelists and any of us who are engaged in thinking about politics. There's not been a lot of sleeping this week. There has been a lot of thinking and trying to reflect on this election, even though it's still in process. And given that I study women in politics, I have been looking at all this with an eye towards gender and in particular women. And so today I want to just talk a little bit about some of the things that I think that we know so far. We don't know everything. And then I would really look forward to answering questions from those in the audience who are attending, who have other things that I don't get to touch on. So first, while the presidential race seems to be having more clarity today, we still don't have the clarity maybe we would all like. But should Joe Biden and Kamala Harris be victorious, we are first of all looking at electing a Kamala Harris vice president, which would be the first woman, the first Black person, the first South Asian American person, the first graduate of a historically Black university. And this is the first time in our 244-year history. So should this happen, if you wanted to just stop there, that's a big moment and achievement for women. And I hope that no matter what, if this is the case, that people on both sides of the political spectrum, on all sides of the political spectrum, will appreciate and take a moment to, recognize this special, milestone. Now, beyond that, I've been thinking about the gender gap in terms of, and there was a lot of conversation about this before the election, and I don't think we know everything yet about what has come out because, first of all, really the only ways that we can measure the gender gap now for the most part is through exit polls. And I'm not a political scientist, but I do know that exit polls are not the best representation of voting. And especially in a year when much larger numbers of people voted absentee and by mail, I think it will skew who's being talked to during these exit polls in ways even more beyond what we know. So take anything I say with exit polls with a grain of salt and, give everyone months afterward to kind of think about it. But, no matter what is shown so far is that the gender gap is actually, at least as far as exit polls go, pretty much the same as it was in 2016 between the women voting for, in 2016, Clinton versus Trump, and in this 2020, Biden versus Trump. And in exit polls, 56% of women voted for Biden, while 43% of women voted for Trump. These exit polls revealed that women of color voted for Biden in much larger numbers than white women did. And in particular, most notably, and what's been pointed out a lot, is that 91% of Black women voted for Joe Biden. And that is, I think that's up from the previous in 2016, and definitely more than even Black men. I know that Rob talked about the Latinx vote some, but I'm going to just try to talk a little bit about what we know about Latinas so far. And this, what I'm drawing from is a study produced by a company called Catalyst, which provides data and analytics for just the Democrats. So I didn't find this kind of data yet on the other side, except that you can extrapolate from what I say here. And what's most notable is that especially young Latinas in battleground states, two of the ones that are still in play right now, Arizona and Nevada, cast 75% of their vote for Joe Biden. And young Latinas are defined Latinas age 18 to 29, right? So whereas, and then overall, Latinas, 29% of Latinas voted for Trump, whereas 37% of Latinos voted for Trump. But the other thing that seems more telling is that what I've been reading is that, and Rob pointed to this as well, that in the battleground states like Wisconsin, which has already been decided, but that Latinx voting in general went up. It went up by 63% in Wisconsin from 2016. And of those new voters, 57% of them were Latinas. So, and I think other than that, the gender gap, I think we're going to really have to wait until we can actually look at who voted on the whole to see what the real numbers are, because I do think exit polling must be really skewed given, like, for example, here in California or in Pennsylvania, where it's showing, right, that Democrats are, in much larger numbers voted by mail early, right? So those people are not participating in exit polls. So it's really hard to see a full pool. The other thing I wanted to talk about is some achievements, not just in the presidential race, but looking at Congress and on a national scale and a little bit locally, that we are on track to have a record number of women in Congress again. So the previous record was in 2018 with 127 women in Congress. That's both in the House and the Senate. And it looks like this year it'll be 134, and it could be a little bit more than that once there are a few races that are still up in the air, like our local race between Michelle Steele and Harley Ruda, and Young Kim and Gil Cisneros, right? So they could increase even further should those women win. It looks like it's going to be a record year for Republican women in Congress. There are going to be 22 women in the House of Representatives in Congress, and there were 200 Republican women who ran. And why this is notable is that in 2018, if you're a historian, there was the first year of the woman, which was 1992. And this just seems so insane to say, but that's when the US Senate went from 2 women senators to 6 women senators, right? Tripling their number in 1 year, and it became dubbed the Year of the Woman. And historians have debated whether it should even be called that. And then in 2018, in the midterm elections, there were all kinds of conversations about, was this going to be the second year of the woman? And people, whether you like the term or not, it got dubbed the second year of the woman because of the record number of women that were elected. But what was notable in this record number of women, I think there were 35 new women in the House of Representatives in 2018. Only one of those women was Republican. And so Republican women, while they still have a long way to go in terms of representation within the Republican Party, made an effort to try to get more Republican women to run and get more Republican women elected. And so it looks like we're on track. I think it's a total of 30 women in the Congress, both the Senate and the House, which is a milestone in and of itself. Locally, I wanted to point out one milestone, which is in Los Angeles County. We are now going to have an all-female board of supervisors with the election of Holly Mitchell. And this will be the first time in the board of supervisors 120-year history that it is 5 women. I think it used to be referred to as the 5 kings, the board of supervisors in Los Angeles. And somebody recently said, well, now it's the 5 queens. But what is interesting about it also is that, LA County is the largest county in the United States, has the largest budget. And so we'll see what difference gender makes. Now that there were already 4 women, so it's not like it's a huge deal, but it is a milestone nonetheless. And then finally, the historian in me that's interested in grassroots politics really wanted to think about the ways that women have been involved in get out the vote efforts and increasing especially the participation of women of color. And, should Joe Biden become and Kamala Harris be the president and vice president, certainly I think people will be talking about the participation of women of color. And Professor Castro already mentioned Stacey Abrams, but should Biden's lead hold in Georgia, and he become the first Democrat to win Georgia since 1992. And before that, it was Jimmy Carter in 1976 and 1980. I think he still won Georgia, even though he lost to Ronald Reagan. That Stacey Abrams' operation in Georgia should get a lot of credit. There were she had plenty of partners and plenty of people helping her, but she registered 800,000 new voters and really focused on how to get out the vote in that state. There are other organizations, both on the right and the left, that were headed up by women to get out the vote. Since I study, sort of feminist women's organizations like the Supermajority, which were created by a very diverse group of women who had long been activists across the nation, to pull their efforts together to both not only promote and help women candidates get elected, but have women participating in get out the vote efforts by writing letters, sending text messages, et cetera. So I think, and then locally, we have all kinds of organizations that have been created in the last, since 2016 as well, that have helped, even in California, to get women involved in politics, not necessarily only to run, but also to advocate for issues that they find important, gun control, et cetera, or to help get women elected to office. So I'd love to hear questions, and by no means am I'm a historian, so I look at it from that perspective, but I'm delighted to hear what you all think.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating to hear about. And so our last political science academic, historian political science, is today's panel is Professor Robinson, whose expertise is on the courts, and hopefully he'll be talking to us a little bit about some of the uncertainty about court challenges and all of that regarding the voting this term. So Professor Robinson.
Thanks a lot, Scott. That actually is what I want to talk about right away. Basically, I want to bring up two things during this election week. I want to talk about recounts, and I want to talk about some of the lawsuits that are going on as we speak throughout different states in the country. So let's talk about recounts quickly first. You may have seen that some states like Georgia, for example, or Wisconsin are doing that. You might want to wonder what that is. So most states have a law, like already built in ahead of the election, that if the vote margins are less than a certain percent, it's usually 0.5% or 1%, depending on the state, then they will recount the votes. Now, I should tell you that 99 times out of 100, recounts do not change anything in regards to who wins. And it's pretty simple. You're having the same people count the same votes all over again. It'd be like if you counted all the socks in your sock drawer and then you counted them again. You might miss one, but you're not going to be wildly off in that count. And so anytime the vote is not, say, in the hundreds in terms of a difference, you're not going to see a recount change the margin. Wisconsin is going to do a recount. It's not going to change the outcome there. And Georgia earlier today was about 1,000 votes, which is really an insanely small margin if you think about it. It's currently crept up to around 4,000, which would make a recount not particularly likely to be outcome determinative. So it's pretty normal for the losing campaign to request a recount if they're under that threshold, because then it's free, the state pays for it. But I think you're unlikely to see anything change. I would be quite willing to bet $100 at pretty bad odds that won't change anything. And then the second thing I want to talk about is the number of lawsuits that we're seeing primarily or maybe exclusively at this point by the Trump campaign. I shouldn't say that. There may be congressional or state lawsuits being launched. But at the presidential level, you've seen lawsuits in a number of swing states. And this is not really uncommon, although I think the Trump administration is doing more of it than normal. It's a pretty normal reaction for a campaign, if you think you're losing, to look for any way that you might change your fortunes. That's something that's not particularly surprising. It's hard to admit that you might lose. You want to find a way out. Particularly true, I think, for someone like Trump, who really is averse to the idea of being a loser and not a winner, if you think of that in all capital letters. I will tell you that every lawsuit that I've seen so far, and I won't claim to have seen everyone, has been thrown out by the courts or has been led to a result that had very little outcome, if any, on the election. And the reasons for that are twofold. One is that some of the lawsuits that are being levied don't really have any good evidence to back them up. So if you can complain about voter fraud or something you think is suspicious or something you saw online, but when you go to a court, you have to go before a judge as a lawyer and give evidence to the judge. And if you can't, that's the end of that. And a lot of the cases just don't have any facts or any, substantive facts, substantiated facts, to support them. So that's one issue. Another issue is that almost always when you're making a lawsuit involving votes, you are addressing a relatively small number of votes in that lawsuit. So maybe you're arguing that a particular county didn't count something right, or votes that came in on this day shouldn't have counted, or votes that the signatures were done in a certain way wouldn't count. Typically, you're talking about a few hundred votes in these little kinds of lawsuits. And given what we're looking at for the margins of victory, the likely margin of victory for Biden right now in Pennsylvania is probably 60 to 80 to 100,000 votes. I don't know exactly where it's going to be in there. There's no lawsuit you can make realistically that's going to change that kind of outcome. I think the only possibility for having a lawsuit be outcome determinative would be maybe in a state like Georgia, where you might end up with like 1,000 votes. So if you're only 1,000 votes apart, then a series of small lawsuits that might cut off 200 votes here, 300 votes there, that might be a meaningful strategy. But at this point, there's just no state where the margin is close enough to make that worthwhile. That's why Florida in 2000 was such a big deal, because Florida was the state and the margin was 500-ish votes. In that circumstance, it makes every sense to do every kind of lawsuit you can think of. And I think some of the lawsuits are more performative than they are substantive, in the sense that they're meant to show the president's voters that they're fighting. And if we're being honest, trying to keep getting money to come in, because some of that money for the fighting is being used to pay off the president's campaign debt. And also because the president wants to see his people fighting for him. And again, I think that's a pretty human reaction. That's not to say that something won't come up that has some sort of substantive fact pattern that could be meaningful. But so far, I haven't seen it. And I'm not aware. The only real success that I can point to for the president was the president in Pennsylvania sued in Philadelphia, arguing that they should be allowed to stand closer to the people who were counting votes. So 6 feet instead of 10, because they argued at 10 feet, they couldn't, I guess, see well enough to what was going on. And the judge ruled that that was acceptable and didn't violate social distancing, was a better interpretation of the law. So what? What does that change? The Republican observers were still there before, they're there now. So that's the sort of thing, and it feels good to talk about that, but again, I think for the most part, the legal strategy is not going to amount to anything. It's understandable because campaigns flail when they lose, but again, barring something I haven't seen, it will not amount to anything. And with that, I'm happy to conclude my remarks.
Thank you, Professor Robinson. That was really helpful for us to make sense of what's going on. There's a lot of news coverage of these lawsuits and concerns about protests around the vote tallying centers. Okay, for our final speaker before we get to our CAPS professional, Joey Forsyte. Joey is the executive director, founder of a band of voters, and I'm happy to introduce her to the Cal State Fullerton community.
Let's unmute. There we go. Hi, everyone. I am very honored to be here with all of you. I've learned a lot, actually, in the last 45 minutes or so, so thank you. I sort of come here through a strange route. I'm actually an artist and a filmmaker who happened to start a nonprofit, a band of voters, to educate and mobilize young people to claim their political power. Why did I do that? I did that because I'm very concerned about the future of this country and the world. And I truly believe that Gen Z and millennials are the most compassionate, inclusive, and thoughtful generation I've seen. And I'm going to assume that some of you are here. And I want to see you reimagine the future and start leading this country very soon to make it happen. You do actually have the power to make it happen. And we'll discuss a little bit more of that. But I'll just give you a little bit of background. My life as a full-time activist really began in 2017. I created an art installation that looked at grief, protest, and voting, and the ways in which those things sort of connect to one another. It was seen by over 30,000 people, mostly young people of color. And I got to talk to many of them about voting. And contrary to what many of my boomer compatriots think, you really do care about voting. You really do care about what's going on. But many of you face systemic barriers from being first gen to transportation, but even more to the lack of education about how government works, why voting matters, and about how to actually vote. And I truly believe this is a form of voter suppression. You know, even in California, we don't make a civics test a requirement of graduation. Voting is complicated. You know, it's not that hard if you once you understand how to do it, but it is complicated. And I think that's often by design. And I think it's almost impossible to vote if you don't know how to do it. If you don't understand why your vote is your power, it also seems meaningless. So let's talk about that power. Right now, 18 to 34-year-olds are 37% of eligible voters, the largest block of potential voters in the country. If you all vote, you will determine the future of this country. But in most states, in this election, it looks like the turnout is roughly around 17 to 18%. That has gone up since 2016. But let's talk about Georgia. Everybody's been talking about Georgia, but Georgia is a really interesting case for young voters as well. The turnout in Georgia, the youth turnout was 21%, and 90% of young Black voters gave Biden an additional 187,000 more votes. So now this race is down to about 4,000 votes. If Biden wins the presidency, it's going to be because of those students. Something similar happened in Madison in 2018 that basically converted the governorship from a Republican to a Democrat. And that is traced back to about 22,000 votes that came from the University of Wisconsin in Madison and the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Okay, so according to Circle, it appears that nationally, Circle is an organization at Tufts University that does research around civic engagement, especially around students. And they're really an amazing organization, and hopefully I can provide a link to their resources. But right now they think that nationally youth turnout is almost 10% higher than it was in 2016. And that was with projections of probably 53 to 56% of 18 to 29-year-olds voting. So imagine what would happen if all of you voted at 75%. That's your country. And that brings me back to our work, to turn out young voters and to build students' political power, and not just students, but young people's political power. So how did we get there? In 2018, my organization worked with student leaders on 8 campuses in it was a kind of prototype program. We provided grants and a large toolkit of interactive art and education to these leaders to host in-person events. At UCLA, one student, Selena Avalos, revived a sort of dormant Bruins vote thing. And with a small team, she increased midterm voting from 4,000 students in 2016 to 16,000 students in 2018. There's some evidence of what student power is, right? How did she do that? She did that through peer-to-peer engagement. You guys know how to turn each other out to vote. You guys know how to communicate with one another. You have a way of communicating my generation could never imagine. That is enormous power. It also involved a lot of events. I mean, Selena did all sorts of events. Her group of people, they did all kinds of things. They got students to pledge, they passed out postcards. They did, events with food, which we helped provide. We sort of bribed a lot of students to show up with free food, and then they had to learn something in order to get a meal. And while they were waiting online, we got to talk to them about things like how to register to vote, how to find out about candidates. So at any rate, leaders like Selena became part of our advisory board. And together at one meeting, one young woman suggested something about lobbying, and another young woman talked about how important education was. And so as a group, we decided that we were going to write legislation to educate and empower students at all the public colleges and universities in the state of California. So there we were, a band of activists and a band of complete amateurs. Like, I'm an artist, and this was a small group of incredible student leaders who worked with me and actually taught me a lot. And one of them, DeAngelique Jackson, is the current president of the NAACP at Fresno State University. And over 9 months, Dion came to Sacramento 4 times to testify. She riveted these committees. She's just a powerful force. And she brought a group of students to lobby. Then there was Sky Wagner. She was a student at Cal State Long Beach. She was also an organizer for March for Our Lives, and she worked with me to lobby and recruit 15 organizations to become official sponsors. Together, we created this bill, which is now mandated for all CSUs and 114 community colleges and all the UCs by invitation. So there was a legal issue there, but they're basically on board. So what is the legislation? It's called AB 963, the Student Civic and Voter Empowerment Act. It's the law that was supposed to be, it's the law right now, and it was supposed to be in effect for this education, but because of COVID and other challenges facing the Secretary of State, it has not been fully implemented. But it will be now. And it requires these basic things. It requires a permanent part-time student and civic engagement coordinator, who I hope will be Professor Spitzer at this college, because I know he's so engaged in this, to be appointed on every one of 147 public colleges and universities, and that impacts over 3 million students. So why this position? This position needs to exist because Bruin's Vote, which was a great program, disappeared the moment that Selena graduated. Right? So we need to have some consistency from year to year. So there's somebody there who has institutional memory, but who is also required, and this is to me what's most important, to form a committee of interested students. The idea is that it is the students who need to every year be part of a committee that develops an action plan around how you're going to engage students civically and how you're going to help them vote. This bill also requires providing basic information for students, where to register to vote, how to help, how to find polling places, but like basic things like, hello, can we put election day on the academic calendar? That was a shock to me when I saw that no universities had that on their calendar. The point that I want to make, though, is that this happened because of the power of young people, of students just like you. Drafting and passing legislation, developing policy, these are also the power of young people. Dion was recently featured last week in the LA Times because she's the youngest member of a committee working to reimagine the police force in Fresno. She organized one of the largest protests in Fresno around the George Floyd killings, and the city actually invited her to come and help her coordinate with the community to try to understand what they need to do. So where do we go from here? What do we do now? I would point out that the next test of student power will be in Georgia. The runoff elections are coming January 5th, and it looks like one or both of the Senate races hang in the balance. So if you're looking for something to do, you can volunteer to help turn out voters for that runoff, which will determine the balance in the Senate. And that's a form of civic engagement. Know that many of the things that impact you are at the state and local level. So learn how to hold your representatives accountable. You can petition them, you can write, you can visit them, or you can write your own damn bill, as Bernie would say. Okay, now, the other thing is to keep educating your peers on the issues and why voting is a key part of your activism and your power, but not the only tool in the toolbox. If you feel the need to get in the streets and protest, know that's your right. Just do it peacefully and do it with the appropriate social distancing to keep you and everyone safe. And finally, if you want to learn more, we have some resources that I'm going to share with you all about our website. We have a toolkit. We have this really cool zines around how to vote and about the way youth protest has changed legislation. And last week, we just aired a live stream featuring 12 activists from 12 different organizations in a really intersectional conversation around how to reimagine safe, sustainable, and equitable futures, and include young people like Dion and Tandiwe Abdullah from Black Lives Matter, Ariel Hobbs from March for Our Lives, and a really amazing group of people who I think are going to be our leaders in the future. They are speaking truth to power about how your generation can and must reimagine the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joey. That was really inspiring, and I hope all my students are out there listening. All right, so we here at Cal State Fullerton understand that all of this uncertainty can sometimes be very challenging. It's challenging for us, and it's challenging for everyone. But there are some really wonderful resources here at Cal State Fullerton for how to process this election in a healthy way. So Dr. Mitchell from our Counseling and Psychological Services at Cal State Fullerton can talk to us about some of the things that are happening and are available for all of us.
Thank you, Scott. Today I'm going to review not only resources, but I want to talk a little bit about election stress and just kind of seeing what other self-care activities that you guys can all be doing for yourselves. You know, in this moment, you know, it's been 102 years, suddenly we're thrust into a pandemic, then we have this very consequential election happening. And I think, you know, I don't look at election stress in a vacuum. You've got all this other stuff going on. Students are sometimes dealing with financial stressors. Some people have lost jobs. Right now we're having problems connecting. Many people are isolating or suffering in silence. We're having reductions in our physical activity. There's challenges with the online learning, and all of us are dealing with that Zoom fatigue at some point or another. So what does that lead to? You know, the uncertainty about what's going to happen with this election, how it's going to impact us. What does that do to our emotional well-being? In June, the CDC did a web-based study, and they compared 5,000 roughly adults to kind of how people were doing in 2019. What they found was there were significant increases in anxiety, depression, kind of across the board, but individuals 18 to 24 and minorities were certainly more impacted. In fact, 40% of the individuals in that study had at least one mental health issue, and suicidal thoughts, while that is normal throughout somebody's lifespan to sometimes have that come up, the rates were really high. So within the last 30 days, when they took that study, 18 to 24-year-olds, 25% of them were reporting thinking about ending their lives. So that, in combination with increased loneliness and isolation, was happening before the election stress ramped up. So moving forward, be thinking about yourselves, be thinking about your peers, and what can we do to help each other through this moment? Now at CAPS, we have various forms of support. We have initial consultations where a student can speak with a counselor. Right now, CAPS is doing all their services remotely. So you just call over to the Student Health Center at 657-278-3040, and you can request an initial consultation. Single session therapy is something we're going to work on. We have drop-in groups that cover a variety of topics. We have the U at Fullerton resources this year. So you can find lots of information related to the election, related to other common issues that students face on that website. There's also a proliferation of calming apps that you can use to kind of help you de-stress. And there's also a lot of psychoeducational TED Talks out there. Now, within the materials that we provide the individuals who came today will be a list of some of those TED Talks that I find helpful as far as dealing with stress and emotions. Now, when it comes to helping yourselves, think of these various areas. Structure your self-care. Our routines have been drastically changed right now, and we have to be more intentional about the efforts we make to handle the stress, whether it be from the election or everything else that you guys are dealing with. The goal is to increase healthy activities so that we don't fall into some bad habits. Procrastination, increased substance abuse trends are a problem right now. There's also, with the election and the emotions running high, all of us have been in situations where maybe tempers were hot and people were having a hard time engaging in civil conversation. So figure out what those healthy coping activities are that you can use to help you de-stress. Taking a few moments of time each day for yourself. Do you ever give yourself affirmations or acknowledgement? Many students tell me, Dr. Mitchell, right now with online learning, my motivation is so low. And these are good students. And they're like, they're kind of judging themselves for their normal reaction to everything that's going on. So I want to help people identify what their needs are, find the healthy ways to help them reduce their stress, and normalize not being okay right now. This is a temporary period of time with many societal issues happening all at once. And just like pandemics from before, or just like contentious elections in the past, as a community, we're going to gradually get through it, and we're going to move on to whatever the new normal is going to be for us. I would also ask you to increase connection in whatever forms work for you or are possible. So for some of us, that's going to be, using social media. For others, it's going to be time with family. Just figure out what ways you can increase that social connection. If you're just kind of retreated or you're back on your own, that kind of has a tendency to worsen mental health issues. Try to be flexible, a willingness to roll with the constant changes. This week, we've had to really work on patience and understanding. I think you all know what I'm referring to. Also work on boundaries. Be informed, but take time away from the news or the different outlets where you're consuming your information. Give yourself some downtime and space and time to recharge. If you just read that information and you find it's activating you and it's getting you worked up, I don't think that's changing anything, and it's kind of putting you in a space that you're probably not in your best place. So whether it's utilizing professional services like support from CAPS counselors, whether it's figuring out what your self-care needs are and structuring more into your routine, or whether it's, just having moments of calm and peace for yourself, these things can help you through this moment in history. And I think it can help you to do better academically, and it can allow you to be more civically engaged. If you're getting overwhelmed by this moment, that can lead to apathy, that can lead to people just kind of checking out and not caring. So work on your stress management. Maybe that'll help you be productive and fully involved. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for all of that really sound and helpful advice. I know I could use it at times for sure. All of us are dealing with that stress, all of us. So yeah, so here's to everyone taking great care of themselves so that we can help each other as well. There are some questions from some of our audience, and I'm gonna take the first one that was asked, which is about the distrust in media. And the question is, if basically half the country have lost trust in the media, how can we trust the media then to get it right about the results in this election? And that's a great question, right? So first of all, I don't know if everybody has lost complete trust in the media on every issue, but I can tell you that the public opinion polling on how credible of people feel the news media is has really declined over the last few decades, as it has in terms of evaluations of all institutions, but news media is particularly low relative to other evaluations of institutions. So the question is, how can people rely on it? How can people rely on it? Well, the one thing I can say to you about this is that the news professionals, particularly at doing the reporting on the election results, are aware of this. And they're also aware of big mistakes that have been made in the past. For example, in the year 2000, when there was a big mistake in calling Florida for Al Gore early and then having to retract that. None of these organizations want to make that mistake. One of the reasons, for example, right now, so they're being very, very careful about not projecting results in any state right now in the presidential election until they really feel that they're certain. What does that mean? That they have enough of the vote that they can look at counted, that any remaining votes, even if all of them went the opposite way, would not change the result that they're about to project. That's how careful they're going to be, even if 100% of the vote went the opposite way, which is why most of the news organizations right now will not call Arizona, although Fox News and the Associated Press have already said that Arizona has been won by Vice President Biden. So I think those are good reasons to trust in this aspect of the media. But you're right, the student who asked this question, you're right that there are going to be lots of questions about how trustworthy are those final determinations when they're finally made, when they say the presidency is won by so-and-so. Okay, so Dr. Robinson, I think there were a couple of questions that you thought maybe you'd like to answer as well.
Sure. So there's a question here about the recount process and, does it check for example, I guess, ballot security? I'm trying to think of the right word here. So every state's a little different. So it's hard to give like a universal description of how states run recounts. I can tell you in the California process that it requires observers to be let in from both parties, just like it would during the normal recount schedule. It allows the recounter to ask for materials to look at. It allows the recounter to offer challenges. So it's not simply just running the numbers again. They try to recreate the process from the first time. So I think, I don't want to speak much beyond California's system, which I currently know the most about. But there certainly is the opportunity for whoever the party is challenging to be in the process, looking at ballots, try to figure out what's going on, and then bring challenges if they think something has gone wrong. And again, historically, you can see that it doesn't usually change that much. You will probably find maybe 200 or 300 votes that maybe shouldn't have been counted, or maybe a couple hundred votes that should have been counted, and those can get thrown out or added. But overall, the processes just don't tend to turn up much because the process is the same and it's set up the way. And so I think for the most part, you can have good confidence in insofar as any process can catch mistakes. I think the recount will do it, and it gives the party challenging opportunities to do so. And then if they feel they have enough evidence, they could also go to a court and try to claim that the process was violated or some such. And so then also, I guess I'm going to take question 3 here, which let me pull up. So question 3 was about why it's taking so long for these votes to be counted when, say, Texas and Florida knock their votes out rather quickly. It's a good question, and it would be nice if the votes were counted before the heat death of the universe. The basic answer for Pennsylvania and to a lesser extent, Wisconsin and Michigan, is that the state legislatures in those states would not permit any counting or preparation for counting until election day. So Florida, for example, and I believe Texas as well, had 2 weeks or more to prepare to count votes, to get everything in order so they could just burn through them in a night. If Pennsylvania had been allowed to do that, they'd probably still be slower than Florida and Texas, but they'd be done already. So that was a choice that the state legislatures, who in Pennsylvania are Republican, made. Florida, I think, actually, because of 2000 and all the debacle there, has done a pretty good job at modernizing and speeding up their process. Something else I would say, it's not just the swing states that are taking a long time to count votes. It's just those are the only ones we're looking at. California has millions of votes to count, and so do lots of other states. We just don't care about them because we're already certain of who's going to win or lose those states. So I don't think those states are particularly problematic. I will say also that the last thing slowing things down, military members have an extra day or so usually to get in their ballots. For example, in Georgia, they had up until 5 today to get that in, as do overseas voters. And then there's something called provisional ballots, which is, let's say you go to vote and you show up at your regular polling place and they say, hey, I'm sorry, you're not registered here. What do you do in that situation? You know, are they wrong? Are you wrong? And so since 2002, after the 2000 election, federal law requires that you be allowed to fill out a provisional ballot, and then you can take it and try to get it verified. And that varies from state to state. And that takes longer because they want to count all the regular votes first to make sure that, you know, nobody tries to vote twice or anything. And then they go back and do all those provisionals, and that's slower. So that slows things down too. And because, as Scott pointed out, the networks are being so cautious, overcautious in my opinion, but I'm sleep deprived and impatient as a human. That's why, you know, it's taking forever.
Thank you, Professor Robinson. Joey, there's a question for you. I would like to, from one of our student leaders here. So Carolina Mendez asked a question, and she said that she's presently the president of the College of Progressives here at Cal State Fullerton, and a vice president in the College Democrats. And she says that basically most of the students are already in their organization, are already engaged and very involved in local efforts. She wants to know what advice you might have for reaching out to students who are disillusioned with politics, who feel ostracized by the establishment, so to speak. What can she tell them to help them to discover their political power?
That's a really, really great question. I mean, one of the things that I found when I was talking to young people was a couple of things. One was, of course, listening, which sometimes I'm better at than other times. But it was really about not making anybody feel ashamed to talk about their feelings about these things. So I kind of suggest opening up the conversation by asking somebody, you know, how do they feel about the process, the political process? Do they feel that there's a place for them? But what I found was the most effective thing to talk about, honestly, and it's sort of the thing that we really advocate when it comes to voting and why you vote, is to really talk about issues. Like to talk about what are the issues that really matter to you. You know, for example, when I was talking to young people, I'd say, you know, do you care about climate change? Are you worried about climate change? Is that an issue that you're thinking about? And so a lot of them, you know, there were students who were very engaged in that. The one subject that always got a response was student debt. You know, and there was, at that time in 2018, when I was on campuses, I could talk about, you know, look, there's maybe now $1.5 trillion worth of debt that is student debt. And at that time, we also decided to give a tax break of the exact same amount of money to mostly corporations. So there's a way of thinking about like how your vote impacts that, right? You can choose a candidate who thinks one way and thinks that, you know, giving money to corporations is maybe going to create some more jobs, and that's going to fuel the economy. Or you can think about giving a tax break to 1.5 trillion people and see what that does to the economy, right? So I think it's about being sensitive to the people you're talking to, and then just trying to find a way in. But I think sometimes talking about asking people what are the issues that are really important to them, or what are the things they're worried about, is a great way to enter that conversation, or it has been for me. I hope that answers your question in some way.
I would just add, get involved with a band of voters.
Yes. Yeah. Please. We'll send you some
leader.
information. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think there's another student question. I think that Professor Robinson, you were going to look at that question.
Sure, I am happy to do so. Let me pull it up, make sure I characterize it correctly. So I believe this is, I'm taking Oliver's question or Blair's question?
Oliver's.
Okay, so Oliver says, this administration has flouted norms to a degree previously unthinkable. Are they irrevocably broken, or can the firewalls be remade? I don't know. And I'd be lying if I said anything different. One of the problems when norms are broken is that the other side faces kind of a hard choice. Do we also break norms? Because if they do it and we don't do it, there's a disparity in the amount of power we can wield. And then if we try to break them more or break the same ones, do we make the country worse off and more divided? I think we're in for a period of more division before we get to a period of less division. And some of this, by the way, is going to be within party. Democrats did not take back the Senate. They're losing seats in the House. And so there's going to be some recrimination among Democrats. How do we win more rural voters? Because they got slaughtered in a lot of rural districts. Republicans are probably going to argue about, if Biden wins, is Trumpism the face of the new Republican Party for 2024 or not? And how hard did people fight for Trump right now during the election? I can see a lot of battles among that. Who will try to take up Trump's mantle, and can they do it? Because it's not clear that you could replicate Trump easily. I mean, he's a singular figure in a lot of ways. So it's a good question. Some of the norms will have to be replaced by laws. That's what happens when norms break and you can't get them back. You really have to change institutions so that what was previously a custom or tradition has to become a rule where there are actual consequences for breaking it. But I wish I could say more about that, but that's the most honest answer I can give.
Professor Robinson, did you want to take this Blair's question as well about the selection of the Electoral College?
Sure. So the question for Blair that Blair asks is, isn't it the case that a state legislature could just appoint anyone they wanted as a slate of electors, effectively choosing where the electoral votes go, regardless of who the voting public voted for in that state? So that's a good question. So it is true that there is no right to vote in the Constitution. And in particular, it's been made clear in cases like Bush versus Gore in 2000, that states do not have to choose electors based on a popular vote. If California wanted to, they could assign electors based on whether, the Dodgers or the Angels have a better record. Well, that's not really fair. So, but it's a silly example. Now, gets to the heart of your question. Once a state has decided that it will use elections as the means for allotting electors and then goes ahead and holds the election, under federal law, and Congress also has a role to play in elections, it's not just states. Under federal law, it's my understanding that you can't just say, oh, well, we didn't like those results, we're going to throw them out. So if, for example, Ohio wanted to say, you know what, this year we're not going to have an election, too bad. They could do that. That would be totally constitutional. What you can't do is hold the election, go through all, get the votes, and then say, screw it. And in fact, most states have laws that don't allow them to do that in the first place. So my sense is no, that's not possible. You would need a veto-proof majority, and it would probably be a violation of federal law. I guess that would put the courts in play, really, So, you know, I've been wrong before, but I would be shocked. And that's an escalation that could truly damage the country in ways that I don't care to think about. So I'd have to think that that's the kind of thing you say when you're angry because your candidate is losing, but that most, you know, the Mitch McConnells of the world are not interested in doing that. So I'm fairly confident, 95% confident that that would not happen.
Only 95%? Just kidding. So first of all, I just thank you so much for that answer. That's a tough question, and because we're in the world of, there's no guideposts really. We haven't had to consider that. There have been some really difficult elections in our history, but you have to go back quite a long way to where we sort of scrapped the idea of letting the Electoral College decide that to like 1876. 1968 was probably the most recent election that I think is horribly difficult when we're talking about assassination of a leading candidate and split votes and rioting outside of the Democratic Convention. This election wasn't that way. So let me talk about a couple of good things to think about. Thus far, we've had peaceful election, and that's amazing. You know, passions are very high. That can be a good thing, that people care so much about the leadership of this country and the direction that it's going to take, that everyone's concerned about it, and that they're showing up in record numbers at the polls, and that there hasn't been any violent outbreak this run up to the actual election and since. Let's pray and hope that we can be an example here and have this kind of a conversation moving forward. So I encourage all our audience members to continue to be involved, and don't think of this election as the last thing that matters in our politics and in terms of your civic engagement. There are lots of different ways to be involved. You don't have to be just voting or protesting. There's all sorts of things you can do in terms of volunteering, getting involved, just learning a lot, having good discussions with people. And I would just encourage everyone to stay engaged. And with that, I want to just thank our Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity for hosting this important event, and turn the proverbial mic back to our hosts, Cecil Chick.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spitzer. Thank you to all our panelists and our moderators for providing such valuable information today. I also want to thank all our attendees for coming. Please join us for our next session in the Critical Conversation Post-Election Series, which will happen on November 9th, this coming Monday at 10 a.m. We'll gather to kind of host a dialogue session on civic engagement and civil dialogue. And without further ado, thank you so much. And we will be sending out an email with different resources, more information about the ban of voters, and also post-evaluation survey that will come out to the email that you use to register. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care and have a good weekend.